will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams, Part 4. The First Cataracts, the Black World's New Borderline. Having lost both Upper and Lower Egypt, Ethiopia's northern border had been pushed to the First Cataract at Aswan, and Necho II eventually became king of Egypt. Beginning the 26th dynasty, 665 through 525 BC, the Egyptian armies were increasingly made up of foreigners and enslaved blacks. It was during this dynasty that the Assyrians were expelled again, this time by nationalistic Egyptians. The blacks lost of their beloved Memphis, Thebes, and even their Egyptian name now seemed to be final. Other invasions came. The Persians under Darius the Great took over, and their domination of Egypt lasted from 525 to 404 BC. With the assistance of Greek mercenaries, they returned to 344 BC to re-establish their rule, but again for only a relatively short duration. Alexander reached Egypt 332 BC, and his world-conquering rampage, but one of the greatest generals in the ancient world, was also the Empress of Ethiopia. This was the formidable Black Queen Candace, world famous as a military tactician and field commander. Legend has it, world in fame, an unbroken chain of victories, marred by risking a defeat at last by a woman. He halted his armies at the borders of Ethiopia and did not invade to meet the waiting black armies with their queen in personal command. Upon his death, one of his most outstanding generals became pharaoh as Ptolemy I, thus beginning 300 years of Macedonian Greek rule. Toward the end of the domination, expansion of the Roman Empire had transferred the real center of the power to Rome, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome. The continuing process of transforming a black civilization into a near-white civilization long before the Christian era. The Ptolemaic period had been largely one of confusion, the division of power among the Greeks, Macedonians, and Egyptians, and intermarriages with the latter, joint rule, etc., made with Ptolemies at times merely nominal rulers. There were times when a native Afro-Asian ruler gained the center of the stage as the star attraction, as in the case of Cleopatra. Upon her death in 30 BC, Romans assumed direct control, ruling the country for 7 centuries, beginning their reign 30 years before Jesus Christ would be born in the same Palestine where blacks have lived and ruled so long. After this long period of domination, the Arab general Amir Rabin al-Az entered Alexandria in 642 AD with only 4,000 men. The conquest of Egypt by the Muslim armies, which had reached Pelusium 2 years earlier, was not only to change the character of Egyptian civilization radically, but it was also to have a disastrous impact on the dignity and destiny of Africans as a people. The Arab conquest had opened the floodgates wider and Arabs poured in. Colonization and Islamization progressed as Egypt became a main center of Arab power. This fact found concrete expression in Arab Islamic expansion over North Africa into Spain and southward into what remained as the land of the blacks. The new borderline of the blacks we have traced the ancient struggles between Africans, mulattoes, and Asians, where the Africans sought not only to resist conquest, but to retake the whole of Egypt. They succeeded at times, but finally lost all of Egypt, as we have seen. Ethiopia now began at the first cataract in the north and extended south into present-day Ethiopia. It was now bounded up by Upper Egypt, the Red Sea, and the Libyan Desert. These are rather general geographical designations without any precise meaning, for ancient Ethiopia had no precise southern boundaries. Ancient Ethiopians would say that their land included Egypt and was in fact without boundaries in Africa, insofar as non-Africans were concerned. All of the European and Asian doctrines about unoccupied regions of Africa at any given period in history are quite meaningless and unacceptable to Africans, for to them it is just as senseless as it would be to say to a farmer anywhere, "See here now, there are large sections of your land unoccupied and unattended, so we'll just come in and take it." The Africans' area of great concentration was ancient Nubia between the first and the sixth cataracts. It was the land where they had developed the great civilization which they had extended over Egypt. Their work had been appropriated by the invaders as their own. The geography of Nubia is the geography of much of present-day Sudan and beyond. The Nile flows through its sand and rocks deserts, with a series of falls and a number of rapids. The country is almost rainless. It is the land of the great Nubian desert. West of the Nile towards the Red Sea was the mining area, rich in gold. It was even within the concept of these geographical boundaries, the heartland of the black world, already pushed by the invaders from the Mediterranean areas in the north, northeast, and northwest. The Africans were to be further hedged in from the east and southeast as the Asian hordes continued to stream across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, much later as the Dutch Boers poured in from the southernmost tip of the continent. The Stone Age Africans lived about the same as Stone Age people all over the world. They were hunters, fishermen, and craftsmen. Archaeologists have dug up some of their tools and their artifacts at Wadi Halfa, Wawa, Sai Islands, Wadi Hadu, and Salima Oasis, Tangasi, Tanya, and other places. These areas are between the second and the fourth cataracts. Our discussion of specific concrete evidence of nearly black civilization up to this point has been confined to the Egyptians north. Most notable among the Neolithic finds in the south were the beautiful, highly burnished blacktop and red pottery bowls, jars, etc. The pottery was artistically decorated in wavy ripples or squares. Their earliest writings was in pictures. So many hundreds of these rock images were found along the Nile through the Nubia land that one may well wonder if these prehistoric historians had posterity in mind. While many of these pictures portrayed wildlife and other objects of the interest in the environment, others went beyond this role of the artist and recorded such historic facts as the conquest of northern Nubia by the Nubian pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, Seneferu, in 2730 BC. This war left a vast wasteland and practically wiped out a civilization that had been developing before Neolithic times. The children of the sun. For one thing, the land to the south of Egypt had developed a strong economy that was continuously enriched by a thriving export trade in paper from papyrus, ivory, gold, ebony, emeralds, copper, incense, ostrich feathers, always greatly in demand, and its most famous decorated earthenware. A strong economy also meant a strong Ethiopian army, posing a threat even to an African-ruled Egypt. From the Egyptian viewpoint, the land of the blacks was a threefold threat. Historically, the blacks who had fled below the first cataract to escape the various conquests never seemed to accept those conquests as final and attempted to retake Egypt from time to time. These repetitions are deliberate because nowhere in history is this very important fact clearly stated. But it is clear that having reconquered the Asian-dominated Lower Egypt, the black pharaohs sought integration with the Asian instead of driving them out of the country. This policy in moderation and accommodation was apparently anathema to the extremist Ethiopians, proud blacks for whom the prospects of having their children come into the world with a color distinctly different from their own was at once an insult to their watching ancestors and an offense to the gods themselves. This attitude might also explain the hostility of the southern blacks toward the Afro-Asian. The latter were not true Africans because they were becoming Egyptians, a mixed breed of many races. They were therefore traitors in the eyes of true Africans, whose badge of eternal honor was the blackest of their skins. This was color racism, deeply rooted, for it sprang from religion. They were children of the sun, blessed with the blackness by the sun, God himself, as thus protected them from his fiery rays. They were his children. Their very blackness, therefore, was religious, a blessing and a honor. The second already stated threat was an economic Egypt's own flourishing export trade, both by sea and caravans, depended heavily on their imports from the south. To cut these off would mean economic panic and an otherwise prosperous land. The third great fear concerned the mighty Nile River. Suppose the Ethiopians decided to bring Egypt to her knees and starve her to death by diverting the waters of the Nile. Belief in this possibility was ancient and ran deep. The Egyptian conquest of Nubia, therefore, might remove the military and economic threats, but so far as the Nile was concerned, it will settle nothing. Besides, these blacks seems to be unconquerable. A Sneferu might attempt total extermination of the population, burning every town and village, destroying farms and cattle, leaving the land in utter ruin. Yet as soon as the armies of destruction withdrew, the surviving Africans would come out from their hiding places and begin to rebuild once again. Like Upper Egypt, this was a land of cities and towns, of temples and pyramids. Africans were the greatest pyramid builders, the temple builders. They had built the great pyramids of Egypt during their rule. Renewed activity in temple building came after Nubia was reoccupied by the 18th dynasty rulers. All this renewed zeal in building new towns and temples in the south was reconstruction. The old kingdom raiders could not destroy all of the temples and other monuments. The returning Egyptians therefore had found many fine temples still in use, others in ruins. All Ethiopian inscriptions on the temples and monuments were erased and Egyptian inscriptions substituted. All outstanding African creations that could not be converted and claimed as the work of Egyptians were destroyed. For now, Egyptian meant white, Asian, or European. This was done to promote national unity. Ethiopian inscriptions, of course, recorded victories of Egypt. The Arabs were to carry out the work of eradication in a far more thoroughgoing manner at a later time. All of the South was never completely conquered. The reconquest we are now discussing extended 40 to 50 miles below Abu Hamed. History continued to repeat itself below the area of conquest, and the Africans continued to rebuild, reorganizing their fighting forces and watching an overextended Egypt become weaker and weaker under weak pharaohs who were unable to cope with the interminable struggle for power among the Asians, Egyptians, and other incursive groups. In these cycles of consolidation followed by fragmentation into numerous chiefdoms and principalities, Egypt mirrored the results of the human power craze not only in Africa but generally throughout the world. Yet in the long view of her history, Egypt's overall record was one of consolidation and unity that at times was not seriously broken for 1,000 years. Napata was a beautiful city that was favored by surroundings that helped to make it so. It was located before the fourth cataract above the Great Curve, where the Nile had turned southward, and as though changing its mind, turned north again. An imposing hill, the throne of the sun god, was the site of temples. The city itself was regarded as the Holy of Holies, the capital of what the Egyptians called the land of the gods. But Napata referred not only to the central city, but included what today we would call a metropolitan area that covered towns and villages for miles in an all direction from the present day down of Karima. It was also to this area that African leaders, including priests of the various coasts, retreated when the things got too hot in Egypt. Here also, certain African kings preferred to stay even when their position and power in Egypt were unchallenged. Most of the royal burials and pyramids were at Kuru. The largest pyramid in Ethiopia is that of King Taharka and Nuri. After the Assyrian-Greek invasion in 590 BC, the city was again almost completely destroyed. The capital was moved to the other side of the river of Meroe, the historic industrial center. The blacks apparently had been more concerned with the development of their copper industry than with iron. Iron ore was in abundance. The earlier failure to exploit it, especially for military weapons, was the reason Assyrians, with their superior iron weapons, were able to sweep the blacks out of Egypt, invading the heartland and destroying the holy city of Napata. The Africans had long since learned the use of iron. They knew all about the smelting process. Why did they allow the Assyrians to get ahead of them? Granting that the ancients kept their military development secret, as nations try to do today, it was almost true that spies, including Africans, were active everywhere. The question is interesting because we are not discussing the period when the Africans had ultimately surrendered to despair and retrogression, but a period of African power, high civilization, and a greatness respected and feared by the ancient world. Even after the onslaught of the Assyrians and their allies, the Africans were to rebuild from the new capital city of Meroe a civilization greater than the one just destroyed. There were many lesser states and countless small chiefdoms in the vast landmass that began where the effective control by Ethiopia ended. Through all of these millenniums of ups and downs, of trials and errors, of great victories and disastrous defeats, through it all, the central drive of this once black land was the direction of consolidation and progress. Tribes were united into one nation, either voluntarily or that, failing by force, strong armies were maintained to protect and expand their civilization. The retaking of the part of the homeland that extended north along the Nile to the Mediterranean was at once the deathless dream, the impassioned goal, and the cornerstone of their foreign policy. These Africans battled the invading Asians decade after decade and century after century until their resistance to conquest and enslavement extended over 4,000 years. From ancient days, therefore, the Africans had, in their very center of the heartland of the continent, a history from which their posterity could learn how unity alone provided the condition for strength and progress, and that each one of the 1,000 little independent chiefdoms were but a standing invitation to the aggressors and the ultimate domination of all. Why did the Africans fail to take the message of the salvation as a revealed truth from their own history? Why did the Africans fail to make this message of salvation as a revealed truth from their own history? What dimmed civilization life on Barker Hill and caused an ultimate withdrawal to the bush and the scattering of people hither and yon like hunted beasts? Why did Africans begin to retire from the race with other advancing peoples and fall so far behind that even the memory of former greatness could not inspire a revival because the memory had been almost completely blotted out? I have been detailing some of the answers throughout, and in later chapters we shall explore further answers to questions raised. We now cross to the west bank of the Nile and journey farther south to the city of Meroe. It is the 18th century BC, and the move to Meroe was simply a move to what was already the southern capital. Only now, instead of having two capital cities in the south, there would be only one. A distinguished line of leaders followed Tanu Taman to the throne in 653 BC. Atlanursa, Sinka Mansikan, and Laman, Aspalta, Amtoka, and Malinakan. Palace, temple, and pyramid builders all. Two of the greatest temples were built by King Aspalta at Meroe, the Sun Temple and the Temple of Amun. The imposing pyramids and rows of huge royal statues added to the majesties and magnificence of Meroe. The royal tombs in Egypt were the repositories of the nation's history. From them, archaeologists were able to determine a line or 41 rulers after the conquest of Lower Nubia. These monuments were not only sources of early African history from within, but of the highest importance. They were elaborately decorated outside with both the first form of writing, hieroglyphics, and the more advanced African inscriptions in their own invented writing. For the Africans themselves had invented writing, and all attempts to connect this ancient achievement with Egyptian or Asiatic influence have failed. Here, the external influence school has suffered a major defeat because the written records found on statues, altars, tombstones, graffiti, etc. were so distinctly African that their native origin could not be successfully disputed. Moreover, the African system of writing was very different from the Egyptian. It was simpler and had vowels, whereas Egyptians had none. There were 23 characters or letters in the African alphabet, 4 vowel signs, 17 consonants, and 2 signs of the syllable. New concepts and new or special words could be easily introduced by the old picture system. Clarity and easy reading was assured by measured spacing between 2 words. A system of numerical symbols for mathematics was developed. The African inscription on monuments and such records as those found in royal tombs were in a special category. General writing was done on tablets of wood and skins prepared for that purpose. Such things as rocks, walls, bases, and broken bits and pieces of earthenware comprise other artifacts where ancient African writing was found. Again, how and why did all of this disappear? How and why was it blotted out or hidden so completely for 2,000 years that an ignorant world with unprecedented research facilities in its universities still believes, teaches, and proclaims that the black man had never developed a civilization of his own? It has been noted that the attractions of Ethiopia, the land of the gods, were great not only because the Egyptians regarded it as the main source of their religion, but also because of its socio-political, economic, and strategic importance. When African kings reconquered Egypt and became Egyptian pharaohs, they still longed for the motherland to the south, desiring to unite the whole of it with Egypt into one vast empire. They would often retire there, some wanting their final resting place to be in a pyramid below the first cataract. To the south rested their ancestors whose company they were to join. Here was the capital city of both the black man's world and that of his heaven as well, the holy city of Napata. During the different periods in which Napata came under a foreign yoke, the capital city of Meroe had to become somewhat holy in its own right, and many of the kings, queens, and other leaders were buried in the pyramids there. These were constructed of stone outside of the city proper, sometimes at a visible distance of 2 or more miles. They were built to stand forever, and attempt to stem them from the Africans' actual belief in immortality. This is why their faith included the natural assumption that those who had passed on, their ancestors, were living in the great beyond and were therefore in the most favorable position to represent the interests and the kinsmen below, or in short, to serve as mediators between God and man. The pyramids ringing the city not only added to the physical beauty of the surroundings, they were also the silent sentinels, the ever watchful ancestral presence from which might come either a benediction or a curse. Earlier, you may recall, I was unsparing in my criticism of those African societies which seems to be governed by fatalism and fail to counterattack against their natural and human enemies. As I read the record, it seems to me that these groups did not try to meet the awful challenges which confronted them. They gave up too readily and refused to ignore tribal lines or to unite for common survival strategies. They remained scattered here and there like hunted animals moving into barbarism and savagery. Such were my structures, and obviously I did not give the whole story, even about these groups. Now, however, and by a glorious contrast, we are in the midst of the blacks, the core groups of all Africa, who met the challenges on all fronts and from every direction, and who fought on and on through the centuries against the forces of man and nature until they themselves were completely overwhelmed. 3,000 years ago, the desert, while slowly moving in on Africa, had not only advanced to where it is today, there was a more arable land in Ethiopia. Although its agriculture did not match that of the rich delta region of Egypt, the blacks were, however, mainly agriculturalists like other Africans. Even with their remarkable industrial development, farming went on both sides where the two Niles met in their land before continuing as one great river through Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. Nor should the importance of the Abara River be overlooked, even though the surrounding deserts were a problem insofar as the agricultural expansion was desired. The more immediate problem was famine from drought. There were years during which no rain fell at all and not a hopeful cloud appeared in the sky. The Africans met the challenge by constructing a national system of reservoirs. These were strategically located around the capital at Musawara, Naga, Hordon, Usada, at Dunabi, in the Jizera region, at Duanib, Bassa, and doubtlessly at other sites not yet excavated. This master plan to defeat drought and famine by a system of reservoirs was more important than all of the architectural art that found expression in their beautiful statues, temples, palaces, columns, and pyramids. The reservoirs were more significant than the monuments, important as these were in hiding the black man's intellectual achievements in the invention of writing deep under the sands. I rate the reservoirs as the supreme achievement because they reflect the real measure of African man as he met the challenge to survive head-on with a constructive counterattack against the adverse forces of earth, sun, and sky. The irrigation system, made reasonably effective with their oxen-powered wheel, was a part of this challenge to adverse circumstances. Pianki, following Kashta in 720 BC, began with what was quickly to become again one of the greatest world powers of the time. Ethiopia was united with Afro-Asian Egypt under a single imperial rule that extended from the Mediterranean in the north to the undefined boundary in the south. Also unknown was how far its eastern boundary extended southward along the Indian Ocean coastline. How much of Uganda and Abyssinia was included or how far westward the empires extended. All of this is not so important as the point that during this period of triumph, world-famed fear, and unprecedented prosperity from a flourishing trade with about one half of the world, African rulers continued to neglect the updating of their military and naval defenses. Iron was the basis of the technological revolution in warfare. That the Assyrians, Hittites, Persians, and other Asiatic nations were equipping their armies with new types of iron weapons, and that these were devastatingly more effective than stone and copper weapons had to be well known to the Africans. It was not news. As was mentioned before, they only not knew about the use of iron, but they had long since developed the iron smelting process. The trouble was the highly secretive royal monopoly. No secret was more zealously guarded than the smelting of iron. This meant rigidly limited production. Here was fear out, matching both reason and the most elementary common sense. This over-secretiveness, which inhibited the expansion of iron production, was to contribute mightily to the success of Assyrians' arms over them. Prosperity, too, may have blurred the Africans' vision. Too much success can be dangerous. In this case, so much wealth was piled up from foreign trade, especially in gold, ivory, and copper, that the question of iron, if raised, may have been dismissed as economically unsound. Whatever the reasons were, the fact is that the great iron industries, which had developed in this century, spreading over Africa, could have started centuries before. Even as early as 300 BC, when iron smelting was employed for more useful purposes than ornaments, the royal monopoly still prevented widespread use. They knew of the importance of iron is shown by the fact that the kings and high priests were often heads of the guild, and the chief iron master would often gain the status of what a prime minister is today. Regardless of the delay, iron smelting and tool making got underway on a vast scale in Ethiopia at a most crucial period for Africa. Its center was Meroe, and it appears that the biggest iron works were in and around the capital city. This development was at a crucial period because it was the period of increasing migrations from the heartland and the scattering of all groups all over Africa. They carried their knowledge of this great technological revolution wherever they went, and they began the use of iron and the development of iron industries wherever they had the opportunity to settle in iron ore areas and remain settled long enough to create a stable society. The spread of iron working from the cradle of black civilization is just another example of how other fundamental African institutions spread over the continent, north as well as south, and remained basically unchanged down through the centuries, no matter how numerous were the groups into which the original society became fragmented, or how countless were the various languages and dialects that resulted from the segmentation. There were, as a matter of course, many variations and modifications by different survival groups. The most remarkable of the facts was that even those groups that were pushed back into a state of barbarism still held on, God only knows how, to some of the basic institutions of the society from which they descended from 1 to 2,000 years before. Neither Christian Europe nor Muslim Asia were able to completely destroy those institutions, even in the vast regions over which both had supreme control, and this is why in a previous discussion I had suggested the smile of compassion when you read or hear about Egyptian influence on this or that black society, because in general all that could possibly be meant is the influence of early black civilization on subsequent black societies. The expansion of the iron culture, however, was a revolution in technology that ushered in a new age and gave new hope to a despairing people. It meant the use of a new instrument of production in agriculture and the industrial crafts, and of great importance for a refugee people, for a new kind of military organization and defense. It can be seen then that the motherland of the blacks centered on the Nile, around the cataracts provided her wandering sons and daughters with the instruments of survival, a knowledge that still served them well centuries after the Arabs and Turks had overran the motherland. The memory of many things had been lost. However, who remembered Thebes, Napata, Memphis, Elephantine, Heracleopolis, or Mecca? Indeed, who remembered even Meroe, the most advanced center not only of the African age but also of writing? And what of the other important towns and cities in southern Ethiopia, Nubia, Kush, Masuwarat, Nuri, Panopolis, Kerma, Aswan, Soleb, Abu Simbel, Kurushku, Samna, Philae, Kawa, Dongola, etc. Our constant references of Napata and Remo might have led those who do not look at the map to think that the areas were only the two important cities in the land. Forgetting the names of the ancient centers of importance was nothing compared to the tragedy of the blacks, and almost completely forgetting the very art of writing which they themselves invented. This was one of the most tragic losses to repeat that was ever suffered by a whole people, and in view of the anti-black course of subsequent history, the blacks indeed needed their written language and records more than any other people. Just how and why this people discontinued the use of writing has been set forth rather clearly and in some detail in the foregoing pages. However, the matter is of such transcendent importance that I hope that some black scholar will devote an entire book detailing this one episode in the long history of Africans. The story would cover the periods of migrations and dispersions when writing was needless, if not impossible, to the general loss of the art itself. I say general loss again because, of course, some African societies did not completely lose the art of writing, even under conditions where its use seemed utterly futile. The most important fact to keep in mind, however, is that we are considering the early age when relatively few people could write, a small professional class, the scribes. All books, scrolls, inscriptions, letters, etc. were written by them. Therefore, in any society where the scribes were either captured or, for whatever reason, disappeared, the art of writing in that society died. In view of the developments in Black Africa, the disappearance of writing is not a mystery at all. Conquest and domination tended to check migrations and bring a larger measure of iron rule stability to the invaded region. An integral part of the iron rule was the introduction of the conqueror's speech and writing, the first step in the process of conquering the soul and minds of the blacks along with their bodies. This was easy because the knowledge-starved key people among the blacks eagerly grasped Arabic, French, Portuguese, English, or German as the best route to status in a new civilization. Most of this developed later than the period we have been summarizing, the 1,000 years in Ethiopia after the last success in retaking Egypt and its defeat and withdrawal from the fall of the 25th dynasty. Here we speak of the period from the 6th century BC to the 4th century of the Christian church in Ethiopia. Christian Africa. Africa was naturally among the first areas which to Christianity spread. It was next door to Palestine, and from the earlier times there had been the closest relation between the Jews and the blacks, both friendly and hostile. The exchange of pre-Christian religious concepts took place easily, and due to the residence of so many ancient Jewish leaders in Ethiopia, Abraham, Joseph, and his brothers, Mary and Jesus, the great lawgiver, Moses, was not only born in Africa, but he was also married to the daughter of an African priest. The pathway for the early Christian church in the land of the blacks had been made smooth many centuries before. In a different work, I suggested that a major reason why so many later Christian missionaries failed in Africa was because they were bringing refurbished religious doctrines that came from Africa in the first place. The religious belief in sacrifice for the remissions of sins was an African belief and practiced at least 2,000 years before Abraham. The results of a comparative study of the African, Jewish, and Christian religions have amazed many who have undertaken the task. Practically all of the 10 Commandments were embedded in the African constitution ages before Moses went up to Mount Sinai in Africa in 1491 BC, a rather late date in African history. We do not know how many significance should be read into the fact that Christianity began to spread in Ethiopia, Nubia, or Kush only after the destruction of the Central Empire with the fall of Meroe. However, the most important development after the empire passed was not the rise of Christianity, but the rise of the two black states that picked up the mantle and staff of Ethiopia to carry on. These two states were Mercuria and Alwa.